3 words changed everything. She's waking up. I wasn't supposed to survive that surgery. I wasn't supposed to hear what they'd done, but I did. And now they're about to learn why you should never underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose. If you're watching this, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The antiseptic smell hit me first, followed by the rhythmic beeping of machines that suggested I was still among the living. My eyelids felt like they'd been sealed with industrial-strength glue, but I managed to pry them open to find myself staring at white ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights. "She's waking up," a nurse announced cheerfully as if consciousness were some sort of personal achievement. Rebecca's face materialized above me, perfectly made up, despite what I assumed had been a medical emergency. My daughter's smile looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror, warm enough to fool strangers. But I'd been her mother for 43 years. Behind her stood Stefan, my son-in-law, checking what appeared to be a very expensive new watch. Funny how medical crisis seemed to coincide with his accessory upgrades. "Mother, you're finally awake." Rebecca's voice carried that theatrical concern I remembered from her high school drama productions. "We were so worried." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like I'd been gargling with gravel. The last thing I clearly remembered was dinner at my house. Pot roast, if memory served, and then that sudden searing pain in my head that had dropped me like a sack of potatoes. "Don't strain yourself," Stefan said, stepping closer with the kind of practiced bedside manner that probably worked well on elderly clients. "Everything's been taken care of while you were recovering." That phrase, "everything's been taken care of," had never, in my experience, preceded good news. "What do you mean?" I managed to croak. "I managed to." They exchanged one of those loaded glances that married couples perfect over time. "Well," Rebecca began with the delicate air of someone about to discuss an unpleasant but necessary topic. "Given your condition and the doctor's recommendations about stress, we sold the beach house." Stefan finished smoothly. For a moment, I wondered if the aneurysm had affected my hearing.
"I'm sorry. What?"
"The Cape Cod property?" Stefan clarified as if there might be confusion about which $3 million beachfront home we were discussing. "The sale went through yesterday. My sanctuary, my refuge, the house where I'd planned to spend whatever years remained to me, watching the ocean and reading books I'd never had time for during my academic career." "That's impossible," I whispered. "I never authorized any sale." Stefan produced a manila folder from his briefcase, with a flourish of a magician revealing his best trick. "Actually, you did right here." He pointed to a signature that bore some resemblance to my handwriting. "If you squinted and had consumed adequate alcohol," the doctor explained that memory issues are completely normal after this type of brain trauma, Rebecca added helpfully. "Short-term memory loss, confusion about recent events." I stared at the document, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. I had absolutely no memory of signing anything related to my house. But then again, I also had no memory of the past week, so perhaps they had a point. "You're probably feeling disoriented," Stefan continued with professional sympathy. "It's understandable. That's why we took care of this for you. The money from the sale will go toward your care," Rebecca explained. "We found a lovely facility in Illinois that specializes in post-stroke recovery." Illinois, 2,000 m from the ocean. I loved from everything familiar. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "Why Illinois?" "It's where we found the best care at the most reasonable cost," Stefan replied. "Your medical expenses are going to be significant, and we want to make sure the money lasts." Something was beginning to crystallize in my mind. Not quite suspicion, but a growing awareness that this conversation was following a script I hadn't been given a copy of. "How long was I unconscious?" I asked. 6 days, Rebecca answered. "The surgery was very complicated. We weren't sure she let the sentence hang, but I caught the implication. They weren't sure I'd survive, and somehow during those 6 days when my life hung in the balance, they'd managed to sell my house. The timing seems remarkably efficient," I observed. Stefan's smile flickered slightly. "We didn't want to burden you with business details during your recovery. Sometimes family has to make difficult decisions." I closed my eyes, trying to process this information through the fog of medication and confusion. When I opened them again, Both Rebecca and Stefan were watching me with expressions that might have been concern if you didn't look too closely. "I think I need some time to rest," I said finally. "Of course," Rebecca said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "We'll let you sleep." As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold despite the warm hospital air. Stefan's briefcase was monogrammed with his initials, but what caught my attention was the small logo underneath. Thornfield and Associates, Real Estate Law. My son-in-law wasn't just any lawyer. He specialized in real estate transactions, and apparently, he just completed a very significant one while I was unconscious. The pieces weren't quite fitting together yet, but I had the distinct feeling I was going to need every bit of the intelligence that had carried me through 30 years of university politics to figure out exactly what game was being played here, and whether I was the player or the prize. Sleep eluded me like a solution to a particularly vexing academic problem. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Stefan's monogrammed briefcase and that smooth signature that was supposed to be mine. By the time morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, I'd made a decision. If someone was playing games with my life, I was going to learn the rules. A new nurse appeared with my breakfast. A cheerful woman whose badge identified her as Eleanor Rodriguez-Aron. She had the kind of competent, non-nonsense demeanor I'd always appreciated in both nurses and graduate students. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. How are we feeling today?" "Like someone who's been informed her house was sold while she was unconscious," I replied, which is either remarkably efficient family management or something considerably more problematic. Eleanor paused in her adjustment of my fore, her professional smile shifting to something more genuine. "That does sound unusual. Real estate transactions typically require the actual presence of the property owner." "One would think so." She busied herself with checking my vitals, but I caught her glancing at my chart with the kind of attention that suggested she was reading between the lines. After 25 years in academia, I'd learned to recognize intelligence when I saw it. "Mrs. Wilson," she said quietly. "In my experience, family members who handle major financial decisions for incapacitated relatives usually discuss those decisions with medical staff to ensure they align with treatment plans and recovery timelines." "And did they discuss this with medical staff?" "Not that I'm aware of." Eleanor finished her checks and moved closer to my bed. "I've been a nurse here for 15 years. I've seen situations where elderly patients' families make decisions that aren't necessarily in the patient's best interest." The delicate way she phrased this told me everything I needed to know about Eleanor's experience with family dynamics in medical crisis. "What would you advise someone in such a situation?" I asked. "I'd advise them to request copies of all documents to understand their legal rights and to seek independent counsel if anything seems questionable."
She paused.
"I'd also suggest they might want to review their medical records to understand exactly what happened before their surgery." After Eleanor left, I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to reconstruct the events leading up to my collapse. The memories were frustratingly hazy, but certain details began to emerge, like photographs developing in a dark room. Stefan had been visiting more frequently in recent weeks, always with some excuse, checking on my well-being, bringing me groceries, insisting on making me coffee. At the time, I'd attributed his attention to genuine concern, though it had struck me as slightly out of character for someone who'd previously shown little interest in his mother-in-law's daily routine. And I'd been feeling increasingly unwell, headaches, dizziness, confusion that I'd attributed to aging and winter weather. Now looking back, the timing seemed suspiciously coincidental with Stefan's increased attentiveness. When Rebecca and Stefan returned that afternoon, I was ready with questions. "I've been thinking about the house sale," I began without preamble. "I'd like to understand the timeline better." Stefan settled into the visitor's chair with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to explaining complex transactions to confused clients. "Of course. What would you like to know?" "When exactly did I supposedly sign the papers?" 3 days before your aneurysm," he replied smoothly. "You called me, said you'd been thinking about downsizing, asked me to prepare the documents, and I signed them where?" "At your house. I brought them by. We reviewed everything together. You signed in my presence." The story was plausible, professionally presented, and felt completely wrong. Not because I couldn't imagine wanting to sell the house. At 72, I could see the logic in downsizing, but because every instinct I developed over decades of evaluating student excuses was telling me this explanation had been rehearsed. I'm curious about something, I said. You're a real estate attorney, but you've never mentioned that in all the years I've known you. A barely perceptible tension appeared around Stefan's eyes. It didn't seem relevant to family conversations, except when your mother-in-law needed to sell her house during a medical emergency. Margaret, Rebecca interjected. Stefan's expertise has been a blessing. Can you imagine trying to navigate this without someone who understands the legal complexities? I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. Rebecca had always been beautiful, but there was something different about her appearance lately. New jewelry, expensive clothes, a general polish that suggested recent financial improvement. You're right, I said finally. It's fortunate that Stefan was available to handle everything so efficiently. They relaxed slightly, apparently interpreting my words as acceptance rather than the growing suspicion they actually represented. After they left, Eleanor returned with my evening medications. How was your visit? She asked. Educational, I replied. Tell me, Eleanor, in your professional experience, how common is it for people to make major life changes immediately before suffering serious medical emergencies? Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. In my experience, Mrs. Wilson, coincidences in medical situations are often worth examining more closely. That night, as I lay listening to the sounds of the hospital around me, I made another decision. If Stefan and Rebecca thought they were dealing with a confused elderly woman who could be managed with smooth explanations and concerned expressions, they were about to discover how wrong they were. 30 years of academic politics had taught me that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who smiled while they prepared to destroy you. Time to remind them that retirement hadn't made me stupid. The next morning brought Dr. Sarah Chin, a neurologist with the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of my best graduate students. She reviewed my chart with the thoroughness of someone who actually read the fine print. Mrs. Wilson, I want to discuss your medication history before the aneurysm. Can you walk me through what you were taking regularly? Blood pressure medication, Lanapril, I believe, a daily multivitamin, occasional ibuprofen for joint pain. I paused trying to remember. Unless, of course, he'd prefer to explain them to a grand jury. Dr. Chin arrived the next morning with the expression of someone who'd found exactly what she'd been looking for, even though she'd hoped to be wrong. She closed the door behind her and pulled up a chair beside my bed. Mrs. Wilson, your toxicology results show elevated levels of blood pressure medication in your system. Significantly elevated. How significantly? Levels that would typically require emergency medical intervention. Combined with your age and underlying health factors, this level of medication could easily trigger the type of cardiovascular event you experienced. I absorbed this information with the peculiar calm that comes from having your worst suspicions confirmed. So, Stefan's supplements were actually my blood pressure medication in higher doses. That would be my professional assessment. Yes. What you thought were vitamins were likely your prescribed lisinopril in concentrated form, possibly combined with additional blood pressure medications. Catherine, who had been sitting quietly in a corner, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone hearing potential criminal evidence. Doctor, in your professional opinion, could this have been accidental? Dr. Chin chose her words carefully. The levels we found would require deliberate, sustained administration of multiple medications over several weeks. This wasn't a simple medication error. It was attempted murder, I said flatly. I can't make that determination, Dr. Chin replied. But I can tell you that what happened to you was not natural, and it was not accidental. After Dr. Chin left, Catherine and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what we just learned. We need to call the police, Catherine said finally. Not yet. I was thinking like a professor again, analyzing all variables before drawing conclusions. We need more information. Stefan may have been slowly poisoning me, but we still don't understand why he thought he could sell a house he doesn't own. Maybe he didn't know about the trust. I shook my head. Stefan's a real estate attorney. Checking title ownership is basic due diligence. He had to know the house wasn't mine to sell. Then what was his plan? Before I could answer, The door opened, and Rebecca entered with her usual perfectly coordinated outfit and concerned daughter expression. Today, however, I noticed details I'd previously overlooked. The expensive handbag, the jewelry that definitely hadn't come from a department store, the subtle but unmistakable signs of someone who'd recently had access to significant money. "Mother, how are you feeling today?" "Much clearer. Thank you." In fact, Catherine and I have been discussing some very interesting legal questions about property ownership. Rebecca's smile flickered almost imperceptibly.
Oh, yes.
It seems there's been some confusion about the house sale. Catherine was just explaining that the property isn't actually mine to sell. The color drained from Rebecca's face like water from a broken pipe. "What do you mean?" Catherine spoke with the crisp precision of someone delivering particularly devastating news in a board meeting. "I mean, the house has been held in an irrevocable trust for 15 years. Margaret has lifetime residency rights, but I'm the trustee with sole authority over any sale or transfer." Rebecca sat down heavily in the visitor's chair. "That's impossible. Dad never mentioned any trust. Your father didn't know about it," I explained gently. "I established it after discovering his affair to protect the property from being transferred to his secretary in his will." "But Stefan said," he showed me the paperwork. "The sale went through." "The sale of what exactly?" Catherine asked. "You can't sell property you don't own, Rebecca. Any buyer would discover the title problem the moment they tried to close." Rebecca's hands began shaking. "Stefan said he had everything handled. He said the legal work was all proper." I watched my daughter's growing panic with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "Rebecca, where exactly did Stefan say the money from this sale went into escrow, waiting for the final paperwork?" She trailed off as the implications became clear. "What final paperwork?" Catherine pressed. "Stefan said there were some technical issues with a title that would take a few weeks to resolve, but the buyer had already transferred funds to show good faith." Catherine and I exchanged glances. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was considerably more complex than simple real estate fraud. "Rebecca," I said carefully, "have you seen any of this money?" My daughter's guilty expression told me everything I needed to know. "How much have you spent?" Catherine asked bluntly. "It wasn't spending exactly. Stefan said we needed to make some investments to protect the funds during the title resolution process." "What kind of investments?" "A boat, some jewelry. Stefan said we needed to diversify the assets." Rebecca's voice grew smaller with each word. I leaned back against my pillows, beginning to understand the full scope of what Stefan had accomplished. He'd convinced a buyer to transfer money for a house he couldn't legally sell, used that money to purchase assets in his and Rebecca's names, and somehow persuaded my daughter that this was legitimate financial planning. It was audacious, illegal, and remarkably stupid for someone who supposedly understood real estate law. "Rebecca," I said gently, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation with Stefan about his investment strategy." My daughter looked at me with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd been swimming with sharks. "Mother, I think we might be in serious trouble." "Yes, dear," I replied with what I hoped was reassuring calm. "You are." But as I watched Rebecca's growing comprehension of her situation, I realized something interesting was happening. For the first time in years, my daughter was looking at me not as a burden to be managed, but as someone who might be able to help her. It was progress of a sort. Stefan arrived that evening with flowers and the kind of aggressively cheerful demeanor that immediately put me on guard. Rebecca had clearly briefed him about our afternoon conversation because his usual smooth confidence had developed some interesting cracks around the edges. "Margaret, you're looking much better today," he said, arranging the flowers with unnecessary attention to detail. "Rebecca mentioned you had some questions about the property transfer." "A few?"
Yes.
I gestured to the chair beside my bed. Catherine was explaining some technical aspects of real estate law that I found fascinating. Stefan's eyes flicked to Catherine, clearly recognizing her as a potential threat, but unsure how significant. "Well, real estate transactions can be complex. It's understandable that some aspects might be confusing." "Oh, I'm not confused about the technical aspects," I assured him. "I'm confused about how you managed to sell a house I don't legally own." The flowers nearly fell as Stefan's hands went still.
I'm sorry.
Catherine opened her briefcase with the theatrical precision of someone who'd spent decades making opposing counsel nervous. The property in question has been held in an irrevocable trust since 2009. Mrs. Wilson has no legal authority to sell, transfer, or encumber the property in any way. Stefan's lawyer training kicked in, and his expression shifted to professional neutrality. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. My title search showed clear ownership. Then perhaps you could show us this title search, Catherine suggested sweetly, along with the purchase agreement, the closing documents, and the disbursement records for the sale proceeds. Those documents are confidential attorney work product, not when they involve my client's property, Catherine interrupted, or when they may constitute evidence of real estate fraud. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Stefan looked between Catherine and me, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he'd planned for this conversation. Margaret, he said, focusing on me with what he probably thought was persuasive sincerity. I think there's been a serious miscommunication. If there are any title issues, we can certainly resolve them. Stefan, I interrupted gently. I think it's time we discussed your supplement recommendations. He went very still. My what? The vitamins you've been bringing me. Dr. Chin found them quite interesting from a pharmaceutical perspective. Rebecca, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly spoke up. What about the vitamins? It turns out they weren't vitamins, I explained. They were concentrated doses of blood pressure medication, enough to cause exactly the type of cardiovascular emergency that brought me here. The silence that followed was profound. Stefan's face had gone completely white while Rebecca stared at him with growing horror. That's impossible, Rebecca whispered. Stefan, you said they were supplements. They were supplements, Stefan said quickly. Margaret must be confused about what she was taking. The toxicology report was quite specific, Catherine interjected. Would you like me to read the relevant sections? Stefan stood abruptly, his professional composure finally cracking completely. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. Margaret, you've been under tremendous stress, and after a brain injury, memory can be unreliable. Are you suggesting I imagine taking the pills you brought me? I asked with genuine curiosity. I'm suggesting that traumatic brain injuries can affect perception and memory in ways that make patients unreliable witnesses to their own experiences. It was a clever legal strategy. Question the victim's competence to remember events. Unfortunately for Stefan, he was dealing with someone who'd spent 30 years listening to creative excuses from graduate students. Stefan, I said with the patient tone I'd once used for particularly slow learners. You're a real estate attorney who attempted to sell property you knew didn't have clear title to using forged documents while systematically poisoning the supposed seller to ensure she couldn't interfere with your scheme. That's not you then convinced my daughter to help you spend money that came from defrauding a legitimate buyer. Probably telling her it was all perfectly legal. Rebecca made a small sound that might have been a sob. The only question I have, I continued, is whether you actually thought you could get away with this, or whether you're simply not as intelligent as your law degree suggests. Stefan's face had progressed from white to an interesting shade of purple. You can't prove any of this. Actually, Ella Lehner said from the doorway. We can. We all turned to find Ella Lehner standing there with what appeared to be a small recording device. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state for recordings, she explained helpfully. And hospital policy requires documentation of suspected elder abuse situations. Stefan looked around the room like a trapped animal seeking an escape route. This is entrapment. This is evidence, Catherine corrected, of attempted murder, real estate fraud, elder abuse, and probably several other felonies we haven't thought of yet. I want a lawyer, Stefan said. An excellent idea, I agreed. You're going to need a very good one. As Eleanor called security and Catherine began making notes about criminal referrals, I looked at Rebecca, who was staring at Stefan with the expression of someone watching their entire world collapse. Rebecca, I said gently, I think it's time you and I had a private conversation about exactly how much you knew about Stefan's business practices. My daughter's tear-filled eyes met mine, and for the first time in years, I saw something I recognized. Not the calculating adult who'd been managing my life, but the scared child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Mom," she whispered, "I think I've made some terrible mistakes." "Yes, dear," I said softly. "I think you have." The next morning brought Detective Sarah Morgan, a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough family dysfunction to find very little shocking. Eleanor had called the police after our recorded conversation with Stefan, and Detective Morgan had spent the night reviewing what she described as one of the more creative elder abuse cases she'd encountered. "Mrs. Wilson," she began, settling into the visitor's chair with a notepad. "I need to understand the timeline of events leading up to your hospitalization." I walked her through Stefan's increased attention over the past 2 months, the mysterious supplements, my deteriorating health, and the conveniently timed house sale. Detective Morgan took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification on dates or specific incidents. "And your daughter," she said, glancing at Rebecca, who sat in the corner looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. "What was her role in these events?" Rebecca looked at me pleadingly before speaking. "I thought Stefan was helping Mom with her finances. He said she was getting confused about her medications, that she'd asked him to handle the house sale, but you benefited from the supposed sale proceeds." Detective Morgan observed. "Stefan said we needed to invest the money while the title issues were being resolved. He made it sound like standard financial planning." I watched my daughter struggle to explain her actions and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Maternal protectiveness. Rebecca had been naive and greedy, but she'd been manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit her weaknesses. "Detective," I said, "I think it's important to understand that Stefan is a professional who specializes in exactly this type of transaction. He knew how to make illegal activities sound legitimate to someone without legal training." Detective Morgan studied my face. "Are you suggesting your daughter was unaware of the fraudulent nature of these activities?" "I'm suggesting that my daughter was lied to by someone she trusted, just as I was." After Detective Morgan left to arrest Stefan, Rebecca and I found ourselves alone for the first time since this entire situation began. She sat beside my bed, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have questioned what Stefan was doing. I should have protected you instead of what, Rebecca? Instead of being relieved that someone else was handling your affairs, so I didn't have to." She wiped her eyes with a tissue. "I've been a terrible daughter." I considered this admission carefully. "You've been a distant daughter and perhaps a selfish one, but Stefan is the one who tried to kill me. But I went along with everything. I spent the money. I believed him when he said you were getting confused and needed management." "Rebecca," I said firmly, "did you know Stefan was poisoning me?" "Of course not." "Did you know the house sale was fraudulent?" "No, I thought Stefan showed me all the paperwork." "Then you were a victim, too. A willing victim who benefited from the crime, but a victim nonetheless." We sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the wreckage of our family relationships. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked finally. "Now you help the police build their case against Stefan. You return whatever stolen money you can recover. You testify truthfully about what he told you and when." And then I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. Beneath the expensive clothes and defensive attitude, Rebecca looked exhausted. Not just tired, but worn down in a way that suggested this hadn't been the first time Stefan had manipulated her into questionable decisions. Then we figure out how to rebuild some kind of relationship based on honesty instead of convenience. Rebecca's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Do you think that's possible after everything I've done? Rebecca, do you love me?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Of course I do. Do you want me to be safe and happy?"
Yes.
"Then yes. I think it's possible. It won't be easy and it won't happen quickly, but I think we can find our way back to being a family." That afternoon, Catherine returned with James Harrington, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in complex fraud cases. James had the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of my best graduate students, combined with the predatory focus of someone who enjoyed destroying criminals who targeted vulnerable populations. "Mrs. Wilson," he said after reviewing the case materials, "you've given us enough evidence to prosecute Stefan for attempted murder, real estate fraud, elder abuse, and probably money laundering. He's looking at significant prison time. What about Rebecca? James glanced at my daughter, who had remained silent throughout his explanation. That depends on several factors. Her cooperation with the investigation, the extent of her knowledge about the fraudulent activities, her willingness to make restitution. I want to cooperate, Rebecca said quickly. I want to help however I can. Good, James replied. Because we're going to need detailed information about every transaction, every conversation, every document Stefan showed you. This case is going to be about establishing a pattern of systematic manipulation and abuse. As James outlined the legal process ahead of us, I realized something unexpected was happening. For the first time in years, Rebecca and I were on the same side of something important. She was no longer the daughter trying to manage my life, and I was no longer the mother being managed. We were two women who'd been deceived by the same man, working together to ensure he faced consequences for his actions. It wasn't the family reconciliation I might have imagined, but it was a beginning. 3 weeks later, I sat in my living room overlooking the Atlantic, breathing salt air that tasted like freedom and vindication. The house felt different now. Not just mine, but definitively, legally, unquestionably mine. Catherine had handled the paperwork to invalidate Stefan's fraudulent sale, and the confused buyers had been surprisingly understanding once they learned they'd been victims of a con man. Rebecca had moved back to her apartment, but visited daily, helping me recover both physically and emotionally from what the media had begun calling the Thornfield real estate fraud. It was a terrible name, but at least it was accurate. The prosecutor called, Rebecca announced, entering with coffee and the newspapers. Stefan's lawyer wants to discuss a plea bargain. What kind of plea? 15 years in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. Rebecca sat down my coffee with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to notice details she'd previously ignored. James thinks we should consider it. I sipped my coffee, real coffee, properly brewed with no pharmaceutical additions, and watched seagulls will over the waves. What do you think? I think 15 years is a long time, but not long enough. Rebecca's voice carried a hardness I'd never heard before. He tried to kill you, Mom. He manipulated both of us. He stole from innocent buyers who just wanted a beach house. The transformation in my daughter over the past month had been remarkable. Gone was the superficial woman who'd been content to let others handle difficult decisions. In her place was someone who asked hard questions, demanded honest answers, and took responsibility for her mistakes. The restitution would cover everything, Rebecca continued. The boat, the jewelry, all the money that went through our accounts. I've already given the lawyers documentation for everything I can remember purchasing. And how do you feel about giving up all those things? Rebecca looked genuinely surprised by the question.
Relieved.
Honestly, I always knew something was wrong. Even when I was trying to convince myself it wasn't. Expensive things that come from hurting people don't feel like gifts. They feel like evidence. Catherine arrived mid-morning with James and an armload of legal documents. She'd been staying in town since my hospitalization, claiming she needed to oversee my recovery, but really providing the steady support I'd been missing for years. The DA's office is prepared to recommend the plea agreement, James announced, spreading papers across my coffee table. Stefan's cooperation could help them prosecute other real estate fraud cases throughout the state. Other cases? I asked. Apparently, Stefan's been running variations of this scheme for several years, targeting elderly property owners, manipulating family members, using his legal expertise to legitimize fraudulent transactions. Rebecca went pale. How many others? At least 6 that they've identified so far. Elderly clients who signed over property rights they didn't understand. Family members who were convinced they were helping with necessary legal work. I absorbed this information with a mixture of satisfaction and anger. Stefan hadn't just targeted me. He'd built a career on exploiting vulnerable people. Were any of the other victims harmed physically? 2 were hospitalized for medication-related complications. 1 died from what was initially classified as natural causes, but is now being reinvestigated. The room fell silent as we processed the implications. Stefan hadn't just been a con man. He'd been a serial predator whose schemes had escalated to deadly levels. I want him to accept the plea, I said finally. Mom, Rebecca began, 15 years isn't 15 years is 15 years more than his victims thought they'd live to see justice served, I interrupted. And his cooperation might prevent other families from going through what we've experienced. James nodded approvingly. The plea also includes lifetime prohibition from practicing law and mandatory financial monitoring for 10 years after his release. What about the civil suits?
Catherine asked.
The victims' families are already filing. Stefan's going to spend whatever freedom he eventually gets fighting lawsuits and paying restitution. After the lawyers left, Rebecca and I sat on the deck, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. It had become our daily ritual, a quiet hour when we talked about recovery, both medical and emotional. Can I ask you something? Rebecca said eventually. Anything. When did you know that Stefan was lying about everything? I considered the question carefully. I think some part of me always knew something was wrong, but I wanted to believe that my daughter and son-in-law cared about my well-being. It was easier than accepting that I'd become an obstacle to be managed. I did care about your well-being, Rebecca said quietly. I just didn't want to be responsible for it. Stefan made it seem like there was an easy solution that would help everyone. And now I understand that easy solutions to complex problems are usually just well-disguised disasters. As darkness fell over the Atlantic, I realized something profound had happened over the past month. The family that had betrayed me was gone, but a new family had emerged from the wreckage, honest rather than convenient, chosen rather than inherited, based on respect rather than obligation. Rebecca, I said as we prepared to go inside, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled these past few weeks. Even though I helped him steal from you, especially because when you realized what had happened, you chose to make it right instead of making excuses. My daughter smiled with genuine happiness for the first time in months. I learned from an excellent teacher my mother, who taught me that intelligence without integrity is just sophisticated selfishness. I laughed, recognizing my own words from a lecture I'd given years ago to a graduate ethics class. I can't believe you remembered that. I remember everything you taught me, Mom. I just forgot to apply it when it mattered most. As we headed inside, I felt something settled that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. The threat was neutralized. The family was healing. The house was truly mine. Some investments in justice yield returns you never anticipated. 6 months after Stefan's arrest, I sat in a courtroom watching my former son-in-law accept his plea agreement with the resignation of someone who'd finally run out of clever strategies. He'd aged considerably during his time in custody. The expensive suits and confident demeanor replaced by orange jumpsuit and the defeated posture of someone facing the consequences of a lifetime of bad choices. Mr. Thornfield, Judge Patricia Morrison said, reviewing the plea documents. You understand that by accepting this agreement, you're admitting to attempted murder, real estate fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy charges across multiple cases? Yes, Your Honor, Stefan replied, his voice barely audible. And you understand that you'll serve a minimum of 12 years before being eligible for parole with lifetime prohibition from practicing law? Yes, Your Honor. Rebecca sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. She'd insisted on attending the hearing, saying she needed to see this chapter of our lives officially closed. I'd offered to go alone, but she'd pointed out that we were both victims of Stefan's schemes and should witness his accountability together. The prosecutor outlined Stefan's crimes in methodical detail: the systematic poisoning, the fraudulent property transfers, the manipulation of family members, the theft from innocent buyers. As the full scope of his crimes was revealed, I found myself feeling not anger, but a kind of academic fascination with the elaborate nature of his deceptions. Your Honor, Stefan's attorney said when given the opportunity to speak, my client recognizes the severity of his actions and the harm he's caused to multiple families. He's prepared to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations and to make complete financial restitution to all victims. Judge Morrison looked down at Stefan with the expression of someone who'd seen enough criminal creativity to find very little impressive about elaborate fraud schemes. Mr. Thornfield, the court finds your crimes particularly reprehensible because they targeted elderly victims who trusted you with their welfare and safety. You exploited that trust to steal their property, and in some cases to threaten their lives. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The court accepts your plea agreement. You are sentenced to 15 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 12 years, contingent on full restitution and continued cooperation with law enforcement. As they led Stefan away, he looked back once at Rebecca and me. I saw something in his expression that might have been remorse, though it was difficult to distinguish from simple regret at being caught. Rebecca squeezed my arm as we watched him disappear through the courthouse doors. "How do you feel?" she asked as we made our way outside. Like a very long, very complicated story has finally reached its proper conclusion. That evening, we gathered at my house for what had become our weekly family dinner. Catherine and Ella Lehner were discussing plans for a European trip they'd been planning since Eleanor's retirement from the hospital. James was reviewing documents for another elder fraud case he'd taken on, inspired by our experience to specialize in protecting vulnerable seniors. The restitution checks should be distributed next week. James announced the buyers who were defrauded will get their money back plus damages. The other victims' families will receive compensation for their losses. What about the property Stefan used as collateral for his schemes?
Catherine asked.
All being liquidated. The boat, the vacation home he bought with stolen funds, even his law office equipment. Everything goes to victim compensation. I found myself thinking about poetic justice. How Stefan's assets were being redistributed to the people he'd harmed. How his career built on exploitation was funding recovery for his victims. "There's something else," Rebecca said, looking nervous. "I've been offered a position with the State Attorney General's office, working on elder protection cases." The room fell silent as everyone processed this announcement. "It would mean using my experience to help investigate other cases like ours," she continued, "helping families recognize the warning signs, working with prosecutors to build stronger cases against predators who target seniors." I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd emerged from the wreckage of her marriage and her poor choices with a clear sense of purpose and responsibility. "What do you think about this opportunity?" I asked. "I think it's a chance to turn the worst experience of my life into something that might prevent other families from going through what we did." Eleanor raised her wine glass to Rebecca for choosing to be part of the solution. We toasted my daughter's new direction, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Unqualified pride in the woman Rebecca was becoming. Later, as the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, Rebecca and I stood on the deck, watching the moonlight dance across the Atlantic. "Mom," she said quietly, "I know I can't undo what happened. The choices I made. The way I let Stefan manipulate both of us." "Rebecca," I interrupted gently, "you've spent the past 6 months proving that people can change when they decide to take responsibility for their actions. I'm more proud of who you're becoming than disappointed in who you were. Do you really think I can help other families? I think you have something most advocates don't have. First-hand experience with how sophisticated these scams can be and how easy it is for loving families to be deceived by professionals who understand exactly how to exploit trust." My daughter smiled with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from finding purpose in painful experience. "Besides," I added with a grin, "you learned from an excellent teacher in how to be suspicious of people who offer easy solutions to complex problems."
"Who was that?"
Watching you learn to question everything Stefan told you taught me to trust my own instincts again." As we headed inside, I realized that the best revenge really was living well. Stefan was beginning a lengthy prison sentence while Rebecca was starting a career dedicated to protecting vulnerable people. Some lessons are expensive, but the education is worth every penny. 1 year after Stefan's sentencing, I stood at a podium in the Boston Convention Center looking out at an audience of social workers, law enforcement officers, and family advocates gathered for the annual Elder Protection Symposium. At 73, I'd never imagined I'd become a public speaker, but surviving attempted murder apparently qualified me as an expert in recognizing family-based financial abuse. 2 years ago, I began. I was a retired professor living quietly in my beach house, trusting my family to have my best interests at heart. I learned the hard way that predators often come disguised as helpful relatives and that the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in concern for our well-being. I walked them through the warning signs I'd missed, The increased attention from Stefan, the mysterious health supplements, the urgent need to handle my affairs.